The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby as Katie Rodriguez pushed through the emergency department doors at Oak Creek Memorial, her new badge still catching the light like a thing unaccustomed to being seen. 2 weeks. That's how long she'd been pushing a medication cart through these corridors, how long she'd been introducing herself as just a nurse with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, how long she'd been running from a life that officially didn't exist. The antiseptic smell hit her first, always did. That particular blend of bleach and human suffering that hospitals perfected, that smell that dragged her backward 13 years to field stations and medevac tents and the moment a sniper's bullet punched through her left shoulder at Phi Base Viper. She forced the memory down. That woman was dead. Catherine Rodriguez, Senior Chief Petty Officer, had been officially erased the moment her Black Ops extraction went sideways in Helmand Province. Now she was Katie, the quiet one, the new hire who kept her head down and asked permission before touching anything. Her medication station was in the northeast corner of the floor, a small rectangular space that faced the nurse's station. Most of the other staff scattered their bottles and vials with the organization of people who trusted their muscle memory and the hospital's alphabetized inventory system. Katie arranged hers differently. Surgical precision. Trauma triage sequence. The way a field medic has to organize supplies when seconds decide who lives and who bleeds out on a desert floor. Syringes by gauge, not by name. Antibiotics grouped by delivery method, for push, piggyback, intramuscular, because in a true emergency you don't have time to search. Vasopressors arranged in order of administration priority, epinephrine first, then dopamine, then norepinephrine. Her hands moved across the cart with the kind of economy of motion that came from muscle memory, from a decade of setting up field stations in the dark, from knowing that inefficiency costs lives. She didn't realize she was being watched until a shadow fell across her organized rows of medication bottles. Impressive system. The voice came from behind her, clinical and assessing. Not unkind, exactly, but the way a surgeon assesses a surgical specimen. Most nurses don't organize like that. Katie turned, and there was Dr. Marcus Hargrove, the cardiac surgeon who'd performed most of the procedures on this wing. Tall, silver-haired, the kind of man whose confidence had been subsidized by 40 years of unquestioned authority. His eyes moved across her medication cart with the intensity of someone reading a diagnostic scan. Just makes the count easier, Katie said, her voice deliberately soft. Deferential. The kind of voice that apologized for taking up space in a room. Reduces the chance of medication errors during rush. Hargrove nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her hands, the scarred knuckles, the calluses that no amount of nurse training fully explained, the way her fingers had arranged those bottles with the precision of someone who'd practiced the movement hundreds of times under pressure. She saw something flicker across his face. Recognition of something he couldn't quite name. You have a medical background beyond your RN, he asked. Just field experience, Katie said carefully. Rural clinics. Limited resources. You learn to improvise. It wasn't a lie. Not technically. Field triage and rural clinic work had similar constraints, limited equipment, high stakes, split-second decisions. What she didn't mention was that her field experience had involved 17-hour surgeries conducted by flashlight in a makeshift operating theater, or that the limited resources had included a 2-hour window before shock would claim a patient and no possibility of higher-level care. Hargrove studied her for another moment, then nodded and walked away. But something had shifted in that interaction. He'd seen something, even if he couldn't quite identify it. The rest of her shift moved in that particular rhythm that only hospitals understood, moments of crushing boredom punctuated by sudden chaos, the constant low-level hum of monitors and fluorescent lights and people in crisis trying not to sound like they were in crisis. Katie moved through it all with the same quiet competence, checking vitals, documenting observations, making recommendations that were always phrased as questions rather than statements. Around 3:19 p.m., the call bell from room for 47 chimed. Katie made note of it on her round sheet and headed down the corridor, her shoes making that particular squeaking sound against the polished tile that she'd learned to either embrace or drive herself insane trying to eliminate. Room for 47 was a private room reserved for cardiac recovery patients, and the man in the bed had the particular stillness of someone used to controlling every muscle in his body. Marcus Webb had been admitted 4 days ago following a routine valve replacement, routine being the operative word until his blood oxygen had dropped and they'd found fluid pressing against his heart. The chest tube had been placed that morning, and now he lay propped at a 45-degree angle with a drainage system running from his left side. His eyes were closed, but Katie knew from the chart notes that he was blind, had been since an IED blast took his sight and both of his closest friends in one moment in 2012. She also knew from the chart notes that he was awake because his hand moved slightly when she entered. "Nurse," he said. Not a question. Just acknowledgement. "That's me," Katie said, moving to the bedside to check the monitors. His oxygen saturation was steady at 94%, his heart rate holding at 72, his BP solid at 118/76. The drainage tube was doing its job, the fluid level had dropped since this morning. She made notes in his chart, trying not to think about how many of those particular vital signs she'd monitored under circumstances that would have made this hospital's current protocols seem laughably optimistic. "There's something in my locker," Marcus said, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd extubated the previous day. "Combat boots. Worn pair. I need them out." Katie paused. That was an odd request for a man 3 days post-op. Worn boots might not be the cleanest option, she said carefully. "Better for infection control if we." "I need them out," Marcus repeated, and there was something in his voice that made Katie stop arguing. The particular weight of someone used to giving orders in situations where lives hung in the balance. The voice of someone who'd been in charge before he'd been broken. "Okay," Katie said. "Give me a minute." The locker room was empty. She found Marcus's locker, room for 47 was posted above the small metal door, and opened it. Inside, folded neatly, were the clothes he'd been admitted in, a pair of worn jeans, a t-shirt that had seen better decades, and on the bottom shelf, a pair of combat boots that looked like they'd walked through worse than time. She recognized them immediately. Not the specific boots, but the type, military issue, broken in until they moved like extensions of skin rather than footwear. The leather still held dust from somewhere dry and violent. She could see the marks where specialized gear had been attached, the scuffs that came from crawling, from running, from being used in environments where boots either protected you or failed you. Helmand Province dust. She was certain of it. Katie lifted the boots carefully and brought them back to room for 47. Marcus was still in the same position, but his attention sharpened as soon as she entered. "I got them," she said, setting the boots gently into his lap. His hands found them immediately, muscle memory guiding him to the laces, running his fingers along the worn leather. When he spoke, his voice had dropped lower, more focused. "Where did you learn the Helmand dust removal sequence?" he asked. Katie's entire body went rigid. She'd adjusted his chest tube as she was leaving. Just a small thing, a minor repositioning of the drainage line because she'd noticed the angle was creating unnecessary pressure against his ribs, and the technique she'd used had come from 17 years of trauma medicine conducted in field conditions, from a specific method taught by a specific team in a specific province. The kind of adjustment that looked instinctive but was actually the result of 1,000 hours of repetition under fire. It wasn't a technique taught in American nursing schools. Marcus's hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Not hard, he was careful with his strength, even sedated, even broken, but with absolute certainty. His blind eyes were pointed directly at her face as if he could see through the darkness behind them. "Phi Base Viper, 2012, he said. "That rotation you used to clear the tension. That's a senior chief signature. That's the medic who held the line for 18 hours while we waited for extraction." His grip tightened slightly. "That's you. You're her." The room seemed to contract. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Outside the window, San Diego stretched out in the afternoon light, a whole world where Katie Rodriguez was just a nurse, where the past stayed buried, where dead women didn't get to choose new lives. "I'm just a nurse," Katie said quietly. But her hand didn't pull away. Marcus's expression shifted into something between grief and recognition. "You were the only one I never identified by sight," he said. "You always kept your face covered. I remember your voice under the howitzer fire, telling us to stay calm. I remember your hand stopping the bleeding on Rodriguez, our Rodriguez. You held him when we couldn't." He paused, and his sightless eyes seemed to look directly into her. "I would have known your hands anywhere." Katie stood very still. The memory of that firebase crashed into her, not slowly, but all at once. The heat. The noise. The certainty that none of them were walking out. And then the medic in the dust-colored uniform, moving between the wounded with hands that were steady when everything else was breaking, deciding triage decisions that no 28-year-old should have to make. "You can't tell anyone," Katie whispered. Marcus released her wrist but kept his hands on the boots. "I know," he said. "The extraction was extraction-level classified. You died in that desert. So did I, technically. We're both ghosts now." He was quiet for a moment. "But you're real. And you saved us." Down the corridor, Katie heard the sound of the nurse's station computer chiming, probably a lab result, probably routine. The normal noise of the hospital continuing around her, unaware that the entire architecture of her new life had just developed a single point of failure. It was at precisely that moment that Dr. Hargrove's shadow appeared in room 447's doorway. He wasn't looking directly at her yet, his phone was pressed to his ear, and his voice was low and measured, the voice of someone making arrangements. "I need information on the new nurse, Catherine Rodriguez," he was saying. "Everything you can find. Education, references, background. Military service if applicable. And I need it within the hour." He ended the call and pocketed his phone, turning his attention to the room just as Katie stepped back from the bedside, her expression locked down into perfect professional neutrality. "Just checking on the drainage," she said, her voice the appropriate blend of deferential and competent. "Patient's vitals are excellent." Hargrove's gaze moved from her to Marcus to the boots now resting across the patient's lap. Something shifted in his face, a calculation, a reassessment. "See that they remain excellent, Nurse Rodriguez," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was no longer addressing just a nurse. "We wouldn't want anything to go wrong with his recovery." It wasn't quite a threat. But Katie recognized the architecture of power being weaponized, the particular way a superior officer uses implications instead of declarations when they want something specific understood. She had just crossed from invisible to marked. The morning staff meeting at Oak Creek Memorial had the chemical smell of fresh coffee and the sterile undertone of antiseptic that never quite left the hospital air. Katie stood at the whiteboard, updating the cardiac census, her voice steady as she presented her patient report. Room for 42, post-op day 3, ejection fraction improving. Room for 45, still on the heparin drip, no complications overnight. Room for 47, the blind seal, stable vital signs, chest tube output minimal. Dr. Hargrove sat in the back corner of the conference room, his tailored jacket draped over the chair, his Rolex visible as he checked the time with deliberate slowness. The moment Katie moved to the next patient update, he interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "Sweetheart, let the Real medical professionals handle the clinical assessment. You just keep the bedpans clean." Laughter rippled through the room. Not all of it. The head nurse, Patricia, kept her eyes on her tablet. But enough voices joined in that the message landed exactly where Dr. Hargrove intended. Katie took one measured breath. Her hands remained loose at her sides. She felt the single tear escape before she could stop it, a traitor of a tear, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. Her voice, when she spoke, had the temperature of a winter morning in the mountains. "I'll remember you prefer form over function, Doctor." The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent panel hum above their heads. Dr. Hargrove's smile didn't waver, but his jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected her to drop her eyes. To apologize. To shrink. Instead, she'd met him with something that looked disturbingly like pity. He watched her leave the conference room, her spine straight, her shoulders level, and something cold settled in his chest. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. He made a mental note. By the afternoon, he was already moving. That same day, around 11:45 a.m., Dr. Hargrove sat in the cafeteria with 3 other surgeons, Marcus Sterling, a vascular specialist, David Chen, orthopedic, and Robert Hayes, another cardiac man. They were discussing the hospital's latest financial projections when Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his voice casual, his tone designed to carry. "I'll bet anyone here $50 the new girl quits by Friday. She's got that look, too soft for real medicine. Can't handle the pressure." He tapped his Rolex. 3 days. That's my estimate. The other surgeons exchanged glances. Sterling raised his hand. "I'll take that bet. 75 says she lasts through next week. You're on." Katie carried her lunch tray into the cafeteria at 12:15, unaware that the stage was already set. She moved through the serving line, grilled chicken, steamed broccoli, water, and turned toward the far corner where the nursing staff usually sat. She didn't see Dr. Hargrove until he was directly in her path. He bumped her shoulder with calculated force, the kind of movement that could be written off as accident, as carelessness, as nothing at all. But it wasn't. It was violence with plausible deniability. Katie's lunch tray tilted. The plate slid. The water cup fell. Everything scattered across the tile floor with the sound of a small disaster, food scattering, plastic clattering, the wet splash of spilled water spreading in a widening circle. The cafeteria went silent. Every head turned. Katie looked at the mess on the floor, then at Dr. Hargrove, then back at the food and broken plate shards. He was still smiling. That was the worst part, the smile. It was the smile of a man who'd already won, who knew the outcome was predetermined, who was simply enjoying the moment before the inevitable. He dropped a patient file at her feet, his tone mockingly concerned. "Oh, I'm so sorry. How clumsy of me. Pick that up, sweetheart. Might as well get used to your natural position." A few surgical residents laughed. One of them louder than the others. Katie crouched slowly. Not hastily. Not shamefully. She moved like someone who had crouched in far worse conditions, who had knelt in sand and blood and the dark, who understood that humiliation was only as real as you allowed it to become. She gathered the scattered papers from the patient file first, discharge summaries, lab values, medication lists. Her hands didn't shake. She picked up the larger pieces of the broken plate, careful not to cut her fingers. One tear tracked down her cheek, just one, and she didn't try to hide it. She let everyone see it. Let them think they'd broken something. Then she stood. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked directly at Dr. Hargrove, and when she spoke, her voice had the quality of forged steel, something that had been heated and hammered until it became harder than the hand that shaped it. "I've cleaned up bigger messes than this, Doctor. Some of them even survived." She set the patient file on the nearest table, disposed of the broken plate in the trash, and walked out of the cafeteria with her chin level. The head nurse, Patricia, watched her go, then glanced at her colleague, the ICU charge nurse named Susan. Neither woman had looked away during the entire exchange. "Did you see her hands?" Patricia whispered. They didn't shake once. Susan shook her head slowly. "That woman isn't who she pretends to be." In the locker room, alone, Katie stood in front of her reflection in the mirror above the sink. The locker room was empty at this hour, the day shift nurses were still on the floor, the night shift hadn't arrived. Just the hum of the heating system and the distant sound of the hospital continuing its endless work. She looked at her face, red-rimmed eyes, wet cheeks, the physical evidence of what she'd allowed herself to feel. The trembling started then, her shoulders shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She gripped the edge of the sink and let herself fall apart for exactly 90 seconds. Then she stopped. She turned off the shaking the way you turn off a switch. She washed her face with cold water, dried it with a paper towel, and checked her reflection one more time. The public Katie was back. Composed. Unremarkable. Invisible. But something had shifted in Dr. Hargrove's attention, something that made him lean forward into the game now instead of playing it at a comfortable distance. That afternoon, he was already making calls. The first went to the hospital's director of risk management, a man named Harold Price who owed Hargrove several favors involving referrals, consulting work, and a percentage of billing codes that shouldn't have existed. Harold, I may have a compliance issue with one of our newer nursing staff. I'm documenting her unauthorized clinical decisions. Just want to make sure we have everything on file in case we need to act. He paused, listening. Yes, the new hire in cardiac care. Rodriguez. Katie Rodriguez. Just keep an eye on the logs, would you? I have a feeling we'll be reviewing her performance soon. The second call went to the hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Elizabeth Benson, but Hargrove was careful with his language. Professional concern. Institutional responsibility. Nothing that sounded like personal vendetta. Elizabeth, I've noticed the new nurse, Katie Rodriguez, performing some clinical assessments that seem beyond her scope of practice. Nothing dangerous yet, but it's the kind of thing that concerns me from a liability standpoint. You might want to review her credentials and her understanding of hospital protocols. By 3 p.m., those credentials were already being pulled. The hospital's HR department was making calls to the references Katie had listed. 3 of them turned out to be disconnected lines. One was a VA hospital in Virginia where a secretary said they had no record of anyone by that name. Another was a clinic in Maryland that had closed in 2015. The head of HR, a woman named Linda Chen, flagged the file and sent it up the chain. But Katie didn't know any of that yet. She was in room for 47, checking Marcus Webb's vital signs, adjusting the dressing on his chest tube with the kind of careful precision that came from hundreds of repetitions. The tube was draining properly, clear, amber-colored fluid, minimal output. Good signs. She was writing notes in his chart when Marcus reached out, his hand moving with startling accuracy for a blind man. His fingers found her wrist, and he gripped it with the strength of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning to navigate the world without sight, whose other senses had become hyperacute. That's not standard nursing protocol, Marcus said quietly. His voice had dropped to something private, something for her alone. That's what you do when you've got 60 seconds and no backup. When you're working in low light and your hands have to remember everything your eyes can't see. Katie froze. Her heart rate jumped, and she knew he could feel it in the pulse at her wrist. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice had changed. It had lost its careful neutrality. Marcus's grip tightened. Your hands know. They remember. Helmand Province, 2012. Phi Base Viper. You were the medic. The one who held the line when we got overrun. You saved my team. You saved me. Katie checked the hallway. Empty. She closed the door partially, blocking the view from the nurse's station. That person doesn't exist anymore, she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. She was erased. The mission was classified. The team was posthumously decorated for an operation that never happened. She has to stay erased. Why? Because erased people can't ask questions. They can't draw attention. They can't become problems for the people who ordered them to disappear. Marcus released her wrist but didn't pull his hand back. He left it there, open, palm up, a gesture of something between trust and surrender. 13 years. And you never came forward. Never claimed anything. I wasn't supposed to survive Helmand. Katie's hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of maintaining the fiction. Coming back into the world, into normal life, being visible again, that wasn't part of the deal. I made peace with being a ghost. It's safer that way. The conversation stopped there because a tech arrived to take Marcus's evening vitals, and Katie stepped back into the role that had kept her alive, the competent, quiet nurse. Good at her job. Not remarkable. Not visible. But she didn't see Dr. Hargrove standing at the nurse's station, watching the interaction through the observation window of room 447. Didn't see the way his eyes narrowed as he watched her emerge from that room, some subtle shift in her bearing, something in her face that had changed. Didn't see him reach for his phone, his jaw working as he calculated his next move. What happened next didn't change anything on the surface. But under the surface, in the institutional machinery of Oak Creek Memorial, something had already begun to turn. Katie first noticed the pattern on a Tuesday morning during her third week at Oak Creek Memorial, when she pulled the cardiac files for the past 18 months and spread them across the break room table like a dealer laying cards. The antiseptic smell of the hospital mingled with stale coffee as she traced her finger down column after column of procedure codes, cost estimates, and attending physician signatures. What she saw wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single catastrophic error. It was something far more insidious, a mathematical consistency that didn't belong in medicine. 74 veterans admitted with stable cardiac presentations. 72 of them received unnecessary cardiac catheterizations. The numbers moved like a glacier, slow and inevitable, each one pulling money from the VA system in $18,000 increments. Not all at once. Not in a way that would trigger audits. Just enough. Just often enough. Routine. Acceptable. Invisible to anyone who wasn't looking at the full picture, and most people never looked at the full picture. Katie's hands moved across the files with the precision of someone who had sorted casualties in field hospitals, separating the salvageable from the lost, the pattern from the noise. Each chart told a story. A 61-year-old Marine from Fallujah with stable angina, recommended for immediate catheterization despite negative stress test results. A 58-year-old SEAL from Kandahar with asymptomatic arrhythmia, sent for cardiac intervention when medication adjustment would have sufficed. A 49-year-old Army Ranger presenting with anxiety-induced palpitations, scheduled for a $22,000 procedure that would never be medically justified in any textbook she'd read in the past 13 years. But the procedure codes weren't the real story. The real story was the medical supply orders that followed like clockwork. Within 48 hours of each catheterization, someone ordered specialized equipment. Cardiac stents. Monitoring devices. Proprietary catheters that cost 3 times what generic versions cost. All from MedTech Solutions International, a company whose business address in San Diego was listed as a mail drop in an office park on Miramar Road. Katie pulled up the company's website, professional enough, glossy enough, forgettable enough. Everything designed to exist in the space between notice and invisibility. She cross-referenced the names. Dr. Hargrove was listed as a consultant on MedTech's website. Just a small notation in the Clinical Advisory Board section, barely visible, the kind of thing someone would only find if they were actively looking. Which most people weren't. Katie took a screenshot. Saved it to her personal encrypted drive. Returned the files to their proper place in the medical record system, moving like someone who had been trained to move through hostile territory without triggering alarms. The next day, she started building her documentation. Not accusingly. Not dramatically. Katie created a spreadsheet under the pretense of a quality improvement project, the kind of thing any conscientious nurse might do. She titled it Cardiac Procedure Outcomes Analysis and began correlating patient admission diagnoses with procedures performed, then crossed that data with follow-up outcomes 6 months and 1 year post-procedure. The pattern became even more obvious when viewed this way. Patients who didn't need the procedures weren't getting better because of them. Some were getting worse. One 72-year-old veteran from Phi Base Shank suffered a stroke during his unnecessary catheterization and spent his final 8 months in a nursing facility, unable to speak, unable to move, his VA benefits drained by extended care costs. Katie documented it all. Not because she was angry. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. She documented it because documentation was evidence, and evidence was the only weapon that worked in institutional settings. Evidence couldn't be dismissed as the complaint of a disgruntled employee. Evidence couldn't be silenced with a poor performance review. Evidence was a paper trail that led somewhere, and that somewhere was usually a place people like Dr. Hargrove very much did not want to go. She brought her findings to the nurse manager first, following protocol with the precision of someone who understood that protocol existed for a reason. Elena Morris was in her 50s, kind-faced, tired in the way that hospital administrators became tired, caught between the people they served and the systems they had to serve. Katie closed the office door and placed the spreadsheet on the desk. "I found something," Katie said. 10 words. Direct. No qualification. No apology in the phrasing. Elena adjusted her glasses and began reading. Her face didn't change, but Katie had been trained to read the subtle shifts, the slight tightening at the corners of the eyes, the almost imperceptible pause in breathing that came right before someone understood they were looking at something serious. "Where did you get these numbers?" Elena's voice had gone careful. "Medical records. Procedure codes. Supply orders. Public data." Elena scrolled through the spreadsheet in silence. 2 minutes passed. 3. The fluorescent lights above them hummed their mechanical hymn, a sound Katie had learned to filter out months ago, the same way soldiers learn to filter out the sound of their own breathing during surveillance ops. "Katie, this is..." Elena paused. Set the papers down. Took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. "This is a serious allegation." "It's not an allegation. It's a pattern. You understand what you're implying?" Katie didn't move. Her voice came out level, empty of inflection. "Unnecessary procedures. Billing fraud. Veteran exploitation." Elena stood up and walked to the window. Oak Creek Memorial sprawled across 15 blocks of San Diego real estate, gleaming and authoritative, the kind of institution that seemed too solid to crack. "I need to take this to the chief medical officer." "Yes," Katie said. "And you understand that if this reaches the board, it becomes a formal investigation?" "Yes." Elena turned back. "You understand that will make you very unpopular with certain physicians?" Katie understood more than that. She understood that she had just lit a match in a room full of gasoline. She understood that Dr. Hargrove had resources, connections, leverage, the kind of institutional power that accumulated over decades of playing the game correctly. She understood that a nurse named Katie Rodriguez, hired 3 weeks ago from nowhere verifiable, without a traceable background, without references who would actually confirm her existence, was about to become a problem that needed solving. But she said, "I understand." Elena made a copy of the spreadsheet before Katie left the office. Held it in both hands like someone carrying something that might detonate. "I'll schedule a meeting with Dr. Brennan. Don't talk to anyone about this." Katie nodded and left. She made it exactly 4 hours before everything changed. The call came to Elena's office at 2:19 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. Katie would never know the exact content of that conversation, but she would see the aftermath. She would see Elena's face when she returned from an emergency meeting on the executive floor. She would see the careful distance that suddenly opened between them, subtle but absolute, the same distance that appeared when someone was suddenly afraid to be associated with you. She would watch as the hospital machinery, massive and intelligent and patient, began to recalibrate around her presence. By Thursday morning, there was an email in Katie's inbox requesting that she meet with risk management. Investigative protocol, it said. Routine credential verification, it said. Nothing to be concerned about, it said. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next was worse than any direct attack. What happened next was the slow, systematic erasure of her authority. Katie was reassigned from the critical care wing to the pediatric floor, a lateral move in title only, a demotion in practice that whispered her incompetence without shouting it. Room for 47, where Marcus Webb lay recovering, where she had been leaving charts for him to read with his fingers, where she had checked his vitals on her breaks, that room was now explicitly off limits. Dr. Hargrove had added a note to Marcus's chart: patient has developed inappropriate attachment to staff member. Nursing assignment revised for therapeutic benefit. No contact with previous assigned nurse. Katie read it on her tablet, standing in the hallway outside pediatrics, and felt the precision of it like a scalpel. He wasn't attacking her publicly. He wasn't making accusations. He was simply removing her access, slowly and with institutional authority, like sand running through an hourglass. And because he had made it seem like he was protecting Marcus from her, anyone who questioned it would appear to be prioritizing a nurse's feelings over patient welfare. She started checking Marcus's charts anyway, just the electronic ones, accessing them from pediatrics during quiet moments. His heart rhythms had begun to show subtle irregularities. Not dangerous yet. Not critical. Just the kind of change that a careful clinician would notice and a freezing resident might miss. She found a colleague she trusted, a night shift nurse named Rodriguez, no relation, just another person with a Spanish surname who seemed to see the things others didn't, and left a note on the back of a medication card: watch his O2 sat during sleep cycles. Drops to 86 to 88. Alert the attending. The note disappeared. Katie found a new shift assignment 3 days later, moved to a different unit entirely. She didn't protest. She had learned long ago that protesting changed nothing. The system would move at its own pace, following its own logic, and resistance only made you more visible. By Friday, she knew. Not because anyone had told her, but because she had been trained to read institutional patterns the way other people read faces. Dr. Hargrove had called the hospital board president at home. She didn't need to know this, but she knew it anyway, the way you knew when someone was watching you in the dark. She knew it because Elena wouldn't meet her eyes in the hallway anymore. She knew it because her name had begun appearing on less favorable scheduling assignments, had been removed from the critical care rotation entirely. She knew it because the system, that great beast of hierarchy and procedure, had shifted its weight and was now pressing down on her. Katie drove home through afternoon traffic, windows down, the salt air from San Diego Bay mixing with exhaust fumes and the smell of wet concrete where a recent rain had left the streets slick. She picked up her son from after-school care at 5:06 p.m., watched him do homework at the kitchen table, made pasta for dinner, helped him understand his algebra assignment. She existed in the normal world for the evening, the world where nurses were just nurses, where people didn't have classified histories, where everything could be explained through paperwork and policy. At 2:14 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, web crashing. Irregular rhythm deteriorating into VFib. New resident frozen. Please. Katie stared at the message in the darkness of her bedroom. She had been waiting for this. Not this exact moment, but the moment where staying hidden and staying safe would no longer be the same thing. She sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the rain hammer against the window like artillery, and understood that the choice had already been made 3 weeks ago when she had given her real name to a blind Navy SEAL and he had called her sister. She found her car keys. Found her hospital badge, which technically had already been deactivated from critical care access but which might still work on some doors if she moved fast enough and no one was watching. Moved to her son's bedroom doorway, watched him sleeping, his breathing steady and safe and innocent. Then she closed the door quietly and walked into the rain. 3 weeks into her silence, Katie knew the deterioration was coming before the monitors showed it. Marcus Webb's breathing had shifted. Subtle. The kind of change that only someone who'd held dying men's chests together could read. She'd noticed it on her last shift, the cadence of his ventilator not quite synchronizing with his body's demand, his oxygen saturation drifting from 94 to 91 when the room temperature dropped. Not critical yet, but tracking downward like a missile on its descent arc. The night shift began at 11. Katie had drawn Marcus's assignment deliberately, trading a shift with another nurse who didn't ask questions. Room for 47. The blind SEAL and his combat boot still sitting on the windowsill, gathering dust that nobody else seemed to notice. She checked his lines methodically. For patent. Chest tube intact. Ventilator settings where they needed to be. His hand found hers in the darkness. "You're worried," he said. Not a question. "Your oxygen curve isn't tracking right," Katie said. "You're working harder to breathe." "I know." His grip tightened. "I felt it this morning. Pressure. Like someone sitting on my sternum." She didn't respond. Couldn't. Because she knew what that meant. Knew it the way Base Viper knew it, the moment before everything goes sideways. 3 hours into the shift, at 2:19 a.m., Marcus's oxygen saturation dropped like a stone. 92. 88. 82. The monitor wailed its electronic panic. Katie was there before the first alarm completed its cycle, her hands already moving, already knowing. "Get me an 18-gauge needle," she said into her radio. Stat room for 47. The on-call resident, a third-year named Patterson, materialized in the doorway with the confusion of someone woken from a dream. His hands shook. His eyes couldn't focus. Katie had seen this before, the moment a young doctor realized they were standing at the edge of something they'd only read about in textbooks. "His SATs are crashing," Patterson said. His voice climbed half an octave. His chest tube. "Tension pneumothorax," Katie said. Not explaining. Stating fact. "His lungs are collapsing. He's got maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest." Patterson's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Katie was already prepping the site, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The needle felt right in her hand, like muscle memory pulling her backward through 13 years and 2,000 miles into Helmand Province, into Base Viper, into the moment she'd done this exact procedure on a lance corporal whose lung had been shredded by shrapnel. The feel of the skin. The angle. The pressure needed to drive through the rib cage without collapsing the lung further. "What are you?" Patterson started. She didn't hear him. Her hands had already moved beyond his objections, already sliding the needle home. The hiss of air escaping was a sound she'd never forgotten, not since 2012, not since the moment she understood what a man's life sounded like when it was compressed into 11 cubic centimeters of trapped air. Marcus gasped. His first real breath in 3 minutes. The monitors screamed their digital relief. Oxygen saturation climbed. 90. 95. 100. The rhythm of his heart steadied, the arrhythmia smoothing into something resembling normal, something resembling a man who was going to keep breathing. "How did you?" Patterson's voice cracked. "That's not, you can't just." The door opened. Dr. Hargrove stood in the threshold, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, still carrying the scent of something expensive and bitter, brandy maybe, or the particular smell of a man who'd been awake all night making phone calls. His eyes moved from Marcus to the needle to Katie's face, and she watched the moment he understood everything he needed to weaponize. "Get away from that patient," he said. Quietly. The kind of quiet that carries authority because it knows it doesn't need to yell. Katie stepped back. The needle remained, doing its work. Hargrove moved toward Marcus with the confidence of a predator recognizing wounded prey. He didn't touch the needle. Didn't need to. He simply looked at it, then at Katie, and smiled in a way that made the monitors sound like they were underwater. "Unauthorized procedure," he said. "Direct violation of scope of practice. Performing medical interventions without physician authorization." He pulled out his phone. "Patterson, document this. Every detail. Every second." Patterson's hands trembled as he fumbled for his own phone, instinctively reaching for the camera to record something he didn't understand but knew would matter. Hargrove was already walking back toward the door. He didn't even look at Marcus, who was now breathing normally, whose saturation was holding steady at 98, who had exactly 4 minutes left before his oxygen would have bottomed out and his heart would have stopped. None of that mattered. What mattered was a nurse performing procedures outside her scope. What mattered was ammunition. Within 20 minutes, he'd made 3 calls. The first to the hospital board president, rousing him from sleep at 2:58 a.m. with words that Katie would never hear directly but that would echo through every conversation that followed: "We have an unlicensed practitioner performing invasive procedures on vulnerable patients. Immediate termination required." This is a liability nightmare. The second call brought the risk management investigator, a woman named Reeves, who arrived in the hospital at 3:53 a.m. with paperwork already printed, questions already prepared, the institutional authority of someone whose job was to protect hospitals from exactly this kind of incident. She didn't care that Marcus was breathing. Didn't care that he would have died in 4 minutes without that needle. She only cared that protocols had been violated, that Katie had no authorization, that her nursing license existed in a file with no military background, no combat medical training, no explanation for how a San Diego hospital nurse knew how to perform procedures that belonged in trauma surgeries. Katie sat in a small room on the 4th floor and answered questions for 90 minutes while her hand stayed perfectly still, while her voice remained level, while she explained nothing because there was nothing she could explain. She couldn't tell them about Phi-base Viper. Couldn't tell them about Helmand Province. Couldn't tell them that she was Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez because Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez had been officially dead since 2012, buried under sealed military files and redacted operational reports. How did you know how to perform a needle decompression? Reeves asked, her pen poised over a form that would determine Katie's future. I studied the technique, Katie said. I have a copy of the protocol manual. It wasn't a lie. She did have a copy. She'd memorized it in 2011, 6 months before Phi-base Viper, when the military had trained her in every emergency procedure that could save a life in a place where helicopters couldn't land. Reeves made notes. Her expression didn't shift. By 5:11 a.m., Hargrove had walked through the documents that had been carefully prepared, previous counselings that didn't exist, warnings about scope of practice that he'd orchestrated in the past 18 hours, formal write-ups that bore dates from weeks earlier but hadn't been filed until after Marcus's deterioration. The paper trail of his competence. Not yelling. Not bullying. Just the systematic, calculated destruction of someone's career through institutional machinery that ground slowly but ground fine. The security guard came for her at 6:51 a.m. exactly. His name was Mitchell. He'd escorted her into the building on her first day. He wouldn't meet her eyes as he handed her the cardboard box containing her personal items, her jacket, her coffee mug, the book she'd been reading during breaks. His voice was flat when he spoke, the tone of someone following orders from above, knowing they were wrong but knowing his job depended on compliance. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm really sorry. Katie took the box. It's not your choice. He walked her to her car anyway, through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and betrayal, past the 3rd-floor window where she could see the sun beginning its rise over San Diego. She didn't look back at room for 47. Didn't need to. She could feel Marcus there, breathing steady because of her, knowing something had gone wrong because he could read the absence of her presence the way a sailor reads wind direction. Her car smelled cold. She sat in the parking lot for 7 minutes with the cardboard box on the passenger seat, her scrubs still damp with the night shift, her hands finally beginning to tremble now that nobody was watching. Now that the theater of institutional authority had ended and she was just a woman alone in a car at 6:07 a.m. on a Tuesday in September, watching other healthcare workers arrive for the morning shift, none of them knowing that one of them was gone. She drove home through traffic that didn't exist yet, through streets still sleeping, through a city that had no idea that a senior chief petty officer was losing her cover. When she reached the house, she sat at the kitchen table in her scrubs, still wearing her name badge that said only Katie Rodriguez, RN, still holding the weight of a lie that had kept her and her son alive. The rain started around 8:51 a.m. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of water against the kitchen window like applause for a performance nobody should have witnessed. At 9:14 a.m., her 13-year-old son came home early from school. He found her at the table, still in her scrubs, tears running down her face in a way she hadn't allowed in public, in a way that made her look smaller than she'd looked in years. Mom. His voice carried the particular panic that children develop when they see their parents' armor crack. Why are you home? What happened? She couldn't answer. The lie she'd constructed so carefully, the explanations, the excuses, the careful architecture of a normal life, all of it was collapsing in real time. She opened her mouth and found nothing but the truth, and the truth was something she couldn't say, something that would destroy them both if it ever got out, something that required her to be not Katie for just a little longer. Her son waited. She didn't speak. And in that silence, something shifted. He watched her face. He watched her hands. He watched the person he believed to be his ordinary nurse mother, and for the first time, he began to understand that she was something else entirely. 3 hours. That's how long Katie sat at her kitchen table in her scrubs without moving, the fabric still damp from the pre-dawn walk to her car, the starch already fading into soft defeat. Her 13-year-old son, Marcus, she'd named him after his father, before his father became a ghost in a uniform, came home from school to find her exactly as he'd left her that morning, except now she was crying without sound, the way people cry when they've run out of reasons to pretend. He dropped his backpack. He looked at her face. And he asked the question she'd been dreading since the security guard handed her a cardboard box at 6 in the morning, "Mom, why are you home? Did something happen at work?" She opened her mouth. She closed it. How do you tell a 13-year-old that you'd been officially erased? That senior chief petty officer Catherine Rodriguez didn't exist on paper, had never existed in the records that mattered, had been scrubbed from the Pentagon's files after a Black Ops extraction went sideways in Helmand Province in 2012. That the woman he knew as his ordinary mother had spent 13 years in the wreckage of a classified assignment, nursing the wounds of people the government would never acknowledge, and now her medical license was being weaponized by a man who'd seen her do what she wasn't supposed to know how to do. She reached for him instead of words, and he sat beside her, and together they sat in a silence that tasted like copper and ash. But that silence didn't last long. Because 3 hours after Katie was escorted out of Oak Creek Memorial with her belongings in a cardboard box, her son made a decision that would change everything. He went to his mother's bedroom. He found the shadow box in the bottom of her closet, behind the winter coat she never unpacked, hidden the way people hide things that are too precious and too dangerous to display. The black case held 4 medals. He didn't know their names. He didn't know what they meant. He just knew, looking at his mother's face when she thought he was asleep, that they mattered more than anything in the house besides him. He walked into Oak Creek Memorial's lobby at 4:30 that afternoon with his backpack slung across one shoulder and the shadow box gripped in both hands. The lobby was crowded with the end-of-shift shuffle, nurses clocking out, visitors arriving with flowers that would die in the same way all flowers did in hospitals, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical dirge overhead. Security didn't stop him. He was just a kid carrying a box. He could have been there for anything. He walked to the reception desk where the same woman who'd checked his mother in on her first day was arranging discharge papers, and he set the box down with the kind of deliberate care you use when setting down something that could shatter the world. The lobby went quiet. People turned. Not because of the box, but because of the rage burning in his eyes, the particular fury of a child who'd just realized his mother had been erased, and now he was about to make sure that erasure cost someone everything. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez," he said. His voice was thin but it carried. It traveled across the tile floor like a frequency that made the air pressure change. "And you fired her for saving a man's life." Dr. Hargrove emerged from his office like something summoned by blood in the water. He took in the boy, the box, the staff members suddenly very interested in their work. He opened his mouth to speak, to dismiss, to command, to exert whatever institutional gravity had protected him for so long, but before a single word escaped, the head nurse, Janet Reeves, was moving toward the reception desk with her hands trembling. She'd worked at Oak Creek Memorial for 18 years. She'd trained 3 generations of nurses. She'd watched Dr. Hargrove humiliate Katie Rodriguez in the cafeteria on her 5th day of employment, had watched the staff laugh or look away, and she'd hated herself every moment since. She reached for the shadow box with the reverence of someone handling the flagged casket of a hero. Her hand shook as she opened it. She read the words engraved on the metal, the dates, the citations that technically didn't exist but existed anyway, carved into the gold of honor. "Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism," she whispered. The words broke across her voice like waves. She looked at the second decoration. Bronze Star with V device for Valor in combat. She looked at the third. Purple Heart. She looked at the fourth, and her voice became something barely human. An commendation from the Secretary of Defense for an operation that never happened. For service that is classified. For warriors, her voice cracked. She couldn't finish. The lobby doors opened. A man in his 60s, grey-haired, and wearing the stillness of someone who'd seen the absolute worst the world had to offer, walked through with a file folder in his hands and the weight of command in his posture. Commander James Chen, retired, had been Marcus Webb's team leader in Charlie Platoon, SEAL Team 3, during the Firebase Viper deployment. He'd watched Katie work under fire. He'd seen her choose other people's lives over her own safety 16 times in that deployment alone. When she was extracted after the operation went sideways, she was the only one of her team who walked out. The classified part wasn't what happened. The classified part was how. He stepped to the reception desk and placed his hand on his former patient's medals like a benediction. "Navy Cross," he said, his voice steady as a surgical laser. "For extraordinary heroism under fire in Helm and Province, 2012. 2 Bronze Stars with V device. 1 for leadership under fire at Firebase Viper. 1 for the extraction operation that never occurred. And because I was there, because I saw what she did, I'm authorized to tell you what the government can't." He looked directly at Dr. Hargrove. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez led a medical response under sustained small arms fire that saved full lives. She maintained radio contact with incoming helicopter support. She performed emergency trauma surgery with only the supplies in her aid bag and the training in her hands. And when the operation was compromised, she stayed behind to cover the extraction of her team. He pointed to the 4th medal. Purple Heart. 1 for a gunshot wound. 1 for shrapnel wounds. And this commendation, signed by the Secretary of Defense, for service that the government will never acknowledge. That's what you fired. That's the person you called just a nurse. The lobby had stopped breathing. Literally. Visitors mid-conversation had gone silent. A nurse standing by the vital station had stopped writing in a patient chart. The only sound was the overhead hum and the distant ping of an elevator arriving at the 3rd floor, and underneath it all, Katie's 13-year-old son watching the man who'd tried to erase his mother finally understand who he'd been fighting. Then the FBI agents walked through the doors. 2 of them, with the particular confidence of people holding warrants and evidence that had been accumulating for 6 months. The lead agent, a woman with a face carved from certainty, approached Dr. Hargrove directly. "Dr. Robert Hargrove, we've been investigating fraudulent billing and kickback schemes targeting VA patients for the past 180 days. She opened a file folder. Systematic overbilling. Unnecessary cardiac procedures on veteran patients. Kickback arrangements with 3 medical supply companies totaling $2.3 million. She looked at him the way exterminators look at insects. The chart reviews performed by Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez provided the final evidence we needed for warrants. Dr. Hargrove's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical if it wasn't so catastrophic. The blood drained from his skin like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened and closed. His hand reached out as if to grab something that was no longer there. His network of allies, the board president who'd called him at midnight, the risk management investigator who'd arrived before dawn, the supply company executives who'd been padding his accounts, all of them vanished in that moment. They simply weren't his problem anymore. He was. The board president, who'd been standing near the elevator, took 3 deliberate steps away from him. The motion was so obvious, so theatrical in its rejection, that it landed harder than any punch. Around the lobby, staff members were nodding. The head nurse was shaking her head in something between rage and recognition. A respiratory therapist who'd watched Hargrove belittle her work 100 times was staring at him with an expression that said, "We knew. We knew something was wrong, and we stayed quiet." "You made us complicit," Janet Reeves said quietly. "You made us watch you humiliate her. And all the while, you were the criminal." Dr. Hargrove tried to speak. His voice came out thin and desperate. "This is absurd. I have documentation. I have authorization. I have." The FBI agent cut him off with the casual precision of a surgeon. "You have emails. We have them too. We have your bank statements. We have testimony from the CFO of Meridian Medical Supply, who's cooperating. We have phone records. We have pharmacy receipts. We have 12 years of pattern evidence that you were systematically overbilling veterans for procedures they didn't need and splitting the profits with people who had no business touching a supply chain. She turned to Commander Chen. Thank you for the military context. It helps establish the federal jurisdiction piece. Then she turned back to Hargrove. You're under arrest for mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and violations of the False Claims Act. The same security guard who'd escorted Katie out at 6 in the morning, a man named David whose daughter was in the army, approached Dr. Hargrove with a cardboard box. It was identical to the one that had held Katie's belongings. His voice was flat with satisfaction, the particular flatness of someone finally allowed to do justice in its smallest form. I believe you know the way out, Doctor. Hargrove took the box. His hands were shaking. He looked at Katie's son, still standing by the reception desk with the shadow box. He looked at Commander Chen, who was watching him with the disappointment of someone who'd once trained warriors and was now looking at a coward. He looked at the staff members of Oak Creek Memorial, at Janet Reeves with tears in her eyes, at the gathered witnesses to his own unraveling. And then he walked toward the doors. The path cleared for him without anyone moving. He passed security. He passed visitors. He passed a bulletin board with photos of staff members of the month. His own face was no longer there. They'd already taken it down. The door slid open. The San Diego afternoon air hit him like a punishment. And the doors closed behind him, and he kept walking, and no one followed. Katie's phone rang that evening. It was Oak Creek Memorial's chief medical officer. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez opened the door to her office as Director of Veteran Services at Oak Creek Memorial. The shadow box her son had brought that day sat on the wall behind her desk, backlit, the medals catching the fluorescent light in ways that made them look less like decoration and more like evidence. On the desk calendar in front of her, she had patient intake numbers, veteran outreach programs, a nationwide initiative she'd developed for detecting billing fraud in VA systems that was being implemented at 47 hospitals across the country. Her chart review methodology, the same one that had made her a threat to Hargrove, was now the gold standard for auditing procedure justification. The thing that had almost destroyed her had become her greatest gift. In room for 47, Marcus Webb sat by the window with his eyes finally opening to the light of the world again. The surgery that Katie had advocated for, the one Hargrove had tried to block, had restored partial sight to his left eye. He could see the San Diego skyline now. He could see visitors' faces without asking them to describe themselves first. And on the windowsill beside his bed, in the place of honor, sat a pair of worn combat boots. The same boots he'd asked Katie to bring from the closet on her first day. Two warriors who had recognized each other without needing to say a word had found their way back to what mattered, the work of healing, the honor of service, the particular grace of being finally seen. Commander Chen attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new veteran mental health initiative that Katie established. He stood beside her during the speech, and when she touched the Navy Cross in the shadow box and said the names of the 4 Phi Base Viper team members who didn't come home, he wept without trying to hide it. The head nurse brought Katie coffee every morning now, and sometimes they sat together, and Janet Reeves would say, "We almost lost you. We almost let him erase you." Katie would look at the boots on the windowsill, at her son's photo on the desk, the one where he was grinning like he'd won something, and at the shadow box that had cost everything and saved everything, and she would say only this: true class is what you do when the lights go out. Outside a strip mall pharmacy across town, Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table with supplemental insurance brochures and a wireless phone. His medical license revoked. His network gone. His career reduced to cold calls and rejections. He made maybe $75 a day, working on commission, and every single car that drove past without stopping felt like a small death. Nobody recognized him. Nobody cared. He was exactly what he'd made of Katie Rodriguez, invisible, erased, nothing. Katie walked through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial now like she owned them, because in a way, she did. The institution had tried to break her and found instead that she was unbreakable. Not because she was invincible, but because she'd already survived the worst the world had to offer, and survival like that changes you into something harder, something true, something that can't be unmade by bureaucrats or cowards in white coats. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes. Comment below, would you have brought the medal box, like Katie's son? What would you have done?